Hello everyone, my name is Jen Nolan and I'd like to warmly welcome you to our 2023 Koadlow Community Lecture this evening. I'd like to begin, however, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Musculoskeletal Australia is very sincerely wishes to thank Peninsula Hot Springs for their sponsorship of this evening's lecture, which has enabled us to offer it free of charge. It's important to state, however, that our sponsor has had no editorial control over the content of tonight's lecture. I'm now very pleased to introduce the CEO of Musculoskeletal Australia, Helen Jens, to officially welcome you to tonight's lecture. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Jen, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Koadlow Community Lecture. As someone who is extremely new to Musculoskeletal Australia, I had the incredible privilege of participating in our Rattle Your Bones Day event this morning and the launch of the 2023 National Musculoskeletal Consumer Survey. Whilst mingling with the amazing presenters and attendees at this morning's event, I was bowled over, figuratively speaking, of course, by this incredible powerhouse of a woman named Trisha Greenway. Imagine my astonishment as Trisha excitedly leapt in to telling me all about her history with Musculoskeletal Australia, which has spanned many, many decades. And all started with none other than Dr. Leslie Koadlow. Les, as he was known by his friends and colleagues, was a visionary, a passionate rheumatologist well ahead of his time, who along with Alice Petty, his secretary, and Molly Riches, a patient, saw the absolute need for an organisation like Musculoskeletal Australia. Their goal was quite simple: to support people for better musculoskeletal health. And over 50 years later, it remains the central tenet of why we exist as an organisation. Had it not been for Les, Alice and Molly's vision, passion, dedication and commitment, Musculoskeletal Australia would not have been able to help, support and advocate for those millions of Australians who live with the impacts of one of the 150 recognised musculoskeletal conditions, including back pain. That is why for over 50 years, Musculoskeletal Australia has been providing support, information, services, and advocating for national action that will deliver real, sustainable, and impactful change that improves Australia's musculoskeletal health. Before I move on to introduce the presenter of the 2023 Koadlow Lecture, I would like to let everyone know about some really important activities we have underway here at MSK. Today is, of course, Rattle Your Bones Day. It's a national call to action to lift the cloak of invisibility and shine a spotlight on what it is like to live with a musculoskeletal condition. It is an opportunity to unite, to rattle our bones and make some noise to support the incredibly important work we do here at Musculoskeletal Australia, as well as letting those living with these conditions know that they are seen, to show support and compassion and understanding, and help them as they navigate what can be, in many cases, life-altering chronic conditions. Another incredibly important initiative that we officially launched this morning is, of course, the 2023 National Musculoskeletal Consumer Survey. Just rolls off the tongue. MSK established the first national consumer survey in 2020. And we were amazed at the number of people who wanted to tell their story and have their voice heard when it came to living with a musculoskeletal condition. Gaining information about the complex issues of living with or caring for someone who has a musculoskeletal condition is so important to building a clear picture of how we go about driving real, systemic and sustainable change that has a positive impact on people's health and lives. I would like to thank our 2023 survey partners, the Australian Rheumatology Association and Pain Australia. We are asking everyone to participate in and promote the survey throughout your personal and professional networks. The survey is open until the 31st of December. Musculoskeletal Australia, along with our survey partners, the Australian Rheumatology Association and Pain Australia, are determined to make this the largest, most comprehensive exploration into living with or caring for someone with a musculoskeletal condition. We need everyone to help us achieve this ambitious goal. So please take the time to complete the survey if you have or care for someone with one of the 150 recognised musculoskeletal conditions. And please promote the survey to all those in your personal and professional networks. This is the opportunity for those Australians whose lives are impacted by these conditions to have their voices heard. To access the survey, once again, head to the MSK website or scan the QR code that is currently on your screens. As I mentioned earlier, I am relatively new to the musculoskeletal world. This is officially the start of my 3rd week in the job. When the team informed me that I had 2 weeks to get up to speed and be ready to introduce the presenter for our 2023 Koadlow Lecture, I did what anyone would and should do. I picked up a copy of Backup and I started reading. And I was so pleased I did. Little did I know, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that back pain is a serious and real problem for millions of Australians. To be precise, 1 in 6 Australians have back problems. And in 2019 and 20, they cost the Australian health system an estimated $3.4 billion. Not only do back problems have serious health impacts, including poorer quality of life and psychological distress, they can impact all aspects of a person's life, including personal, professional, and financial. That is why it is such a great privilege to have the multi-award-winning national science reporter for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, the 2019 Eureka Prize winner for science journalism, and the 2020 Wakely Award winner for short feature writing, Liam Mannix, present the 2023 Koadlow Lecture. Welcome, Liam.
Thank you so much, Helen. And what a fantastic introduction that was. It is a great honour, I have to say, to be invited to give the prestigious annual Koadlow Lecture held in honour of Dr. Leslie Koadlow, the founder of Musculoskeletal Australia. Since I've been invited and gotten to know Musculoskeletal Australia, I've been struck by their real commitment to spreading the science and the evidence and pushing evidence-based medicine. As hopefully you'll come to hear tonight, as I talk you through what we found in investigating back pain for this book, that commitment to science and to evidence-based medicine, unfortunately, is very rare. So, I am very excited to give this lecture tonight because it's my belief, after writing Backup, that we are at a pivotal moment in the long and very miserable history of back pain. Despite decades of trying to treat this condition, we've actually seen an increase in people with back pain and chronic back pain all around the world. We've spent millions and millions of dollars on research and for a really long time got ourselves absolutely nowhere. And worst of all, I think, we've developed an incredible and incredibly expensive arsenal of treatments for back pain, which by and large don't work and often make the problem worse. So, why am I excited given all of this? Because I think we stand on the precipice of real change. We have a new understanding of the causes of back pain, and we're actually starting to develop treatments based on that new understanding that really work. That's what I discovered when I started researching this field to write back up. These are my conflicts of interest. Just to talk you through. I work as a science reporter for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and I receive royalties from the sales of Backup, but I don't receive any payment for this lecture or from any other companies or organizations. Tonight, I want to talk to you about this epidemic of back pain that we're facing and some of the causes that are starting to come into focus. I've skipped ahead on my slides, my apologies. Then we're going to look at some of the treatments that are offered for back pain and why they often don't work or are harmful. And we're going to finish with the exciting stuff, the new neuroscience of back pain and the treatments that are starting to emerge from it. So let's dive in. I developed back pain at about 16. Chronic back pain isn't very common at this age, but I got it. Maybe because of a sudden growth spurt. That's what my mum reckons anyway. Anyway, for about 3 years, I would regularly deal with back pain. Sometimes it was general soreness, sometimes it was a dull ache, sometimes it was spasms that would lay me out for days. I've spent days in bed, days lying on the floor waiting for the pain to go away. A physio told me I had a slipped disc poking out into my muscle, and I swore I could feel that bulging disc with every footfall on concrete and every time I went to bend over. I, in fact, at one point even stopped bending over and said to my mum, I can't help you with chores because I have a bad back. You can imagine how well that was received. This photo is my father on the right, and my little daughter on the left. He's just fed her a piece of bacon, much to her mother's annoyance, but that's the role of grandparents, isn't it? He had back pain much worse, and it was for him that I really wrote the book. He was a foreign correspondent, a foreign journalist. So he spent years lugging heavy equipment across Europe in and out of planes and cars and taxis and trains. His back just started aching one day and never stopped. And over about a decade, it got worse and worse until he could feel his muscles and his spine start to twist like a corkscrew. He took to walking with crutches. He thought he'd end up in a wheelchair. He was in and out of hospital, in and out of consciousness, suicidal at some points, I discovered writing this book. He ended up, after trying opioids and mindfulness and injections, going under the surgeon's knife. And it seemed to cure him. He's back running marathons. It's quite amazing. But as I discovered when I started researching back pain, all was not as it seemed. More on that in a moment. But let's start with the problem of back pain itself. How big is it? Stunningly enormous. Have a look at this. This is the prevalence of back pain, age standardized across the world. And what you'll find striking about this is that, I look at a lot of maps like this covering health and science, and typically diseases will affect the least well-off countries, Africa and Latin America. But back pain really seems to be a problem of the wealthy West, and it's growing. So this is important. Hold this in your mind. The Lancet, the venerable medical journal, describes back pain as one of the biggest problems for public health systems in the Western world. And now, says the Lancet, it seems to be extending worldwide. As many as 84% of us will suffer back pain at some time in our lives, and it will put about 180,000 Australians in hospital every year. Back problems are the leading health burden for Australians aged 45 to 74, and our second biggest health burden overall behind heart problems. And of everyone who gets back pain, about 10 to 15% will develop chronic back pain that doesn't go away, back pain that ruins your life. These are crazy numbers. And I, as a journalist, wanted to know why. Why are so many people have back pain? Now, for a long time, we've been told that this is about the fragility in your back, that perhaps spines are not well built, that they may crumble at the slightest insult, that really we should be walking on all fours like apes or horses. But that answer never seemed to make a lot of sense, because we know that a healthy back is a strong back. A healthy back can lift great weights, and strong men can do amazing feats of strength. So we know that backs themselves are strong. Why is it that so many people then have back pain? To answer this question, researchers have looked somewhere unexpected: regional Indigenous communities. In 1988, a pair of researchers visited a small First Nations community in the Pitjantjatjara homelands in Central Australia. My apologies if I've mispronounced that. They wanted to study back pain, but they ran into a big problem. The local community didn't really have it. Nobody was reporting it or going to the medical clinic with back pain. It wasn't interfering with their lives. It was only when these researchers pressed deeper, taking detailed histories, that the people fessed up. Actually, yes, my back does hurt. It's just not something that I ever really thought about it until you, the researcher, brought it up with me. The researchers were able to report that the back pain rate, the real back pain rate, was actually twice that seen in Australians living in the big city. But none of these people with back pain thought of themselves as back pain sufferers, and their lives weren't really affected by it. They had back pain, but they didn't have back pain. Curious. Fast forward another few decades. Another research team heads out to remote First Nations communities, and they discover something entirely different. They discover a back pain epidemic. They come across people who were in a great deal of pain and were very disabled. These people had been shown scans showing arthritis or slipped discs, and they'd been told by their health professionals to be worried, to be fearful of their spines. Some had already been referred on for spinal fusion. And these messages about fear and fragility, they were coming from their doctors. Hopefully we can see these. These are some of the anonymized survey results that the researchers were getting back when they went out. Let me read just one. It's the doc that said that, if I don't slow down or quit playing sports or whatever, I could, do more damage or end up in a wheelchair or whatever. And if I don't have sports, I don't really have anything. I feel bored. I don't have a life. This is a picture of a community whose life is being ruined by back pain. Is it possible that back pain has gotten so much worse among this group in the last few decades? Maybe. But what some scientists think is more likely is the modern Western way of thinking about and treating back pain has actually led to an increase in fear and disability. By changing the way we think about our backs, we've changed our experience of back pain for the worst. Let's ponder how we think about our backs in modern society. We think that if you don't lift with a straight back, you'll hurt it. We think that if you don't have your desk set up ergonomically, correct height, mouse in the right spot, that you'll hurt your back. We think you need to stand up straight to protect your spine, and we think that you need a strong core to hold it all together. Look at all these. This was just the results of a few minutes of Googling from me. We have become terrifically obsessed and terrified that our backs are points of weaknesses. So on the left here, you can see posture correction devices. I met with some, entrepreneurs, I suppose you'd say, who were selling some of these. And they were telling me, if you don't care for your posture, your back will fail you and you'll be on the road to a spinal fusion. And on the right, you can see some of the images that are propagated by some of the very, very large companies that sell ergonomic products. Look at the message that we're getting here, that, a certain posture, a certain way of sitting may harm your spine. You can see it down the bottom in the chairs. This is very common. This is the way that we think about backs in a modern society. We have become obsessed with protecting them because we have come to think of them as fragile. Jenga tower spines, waiting to wobble and collapse at the merest insult. What I discovered writing back up, and this really shocks me, is that none of that is true. Ergonomics, bollocks. Lifting with a straight back, bollocks. Strong core posture, bollocks. It's incredible. When you look at the data and speak to the researchers, it becomes abundantly clear that there is no evidence supporting any of this. These are essentially wildly successful old wives' tales. I took a particularly close look at ergonomics because it has infiltrated my office. I'm here today in the offices of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and out there, all of our seats are ergonomically adjusted, and they all have little levers allowing us to move them up and down. And if we so wished, we could have people come in and make sure that our mouse pads line up in this perfect form. But the reality is there isn't really much evidence to back any of that up. And when the studies have been done, they come back reporting no real difference. It's remarkable, and yet we've swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker. It's like lifting with a straight back. We have this idea that if you don't lift in a very specific way, and I'm sure you know it, bending the knees, holding the back straight, pulling the thing up as close to you as possible, that you'll hurt your back. Now, does it make sense? Do we see other creatures lifting in such a strange, cumbersome way? Does it make sense that our bodies would only serve us well if we performed some sort of strange ergonomic ritual? I think when you look at it closely, the emperor wears no clothes. And we've now done the studies, and this is the exciting bit that I discovered in backup, careful studies that look at how people sit throughout the day. And we found no association between different sitting postures and back pain. I spoke to researchers who had gotten very excited about this idea that core strength was key, and they devised these really careful exercise programs full of strange exercises that really work on building that strong, healthy core around your spine. And they had been disappointed when their results came back showing that these special core-focused exercise programs didn't really affect people's incidence of back pain. We just don't see it in the data. All of these ideas, scientists suspect, are doing something to us. They're not just harmless bits of fun. They're not just entrepreneurs making money selling you strangely shaped chairs. They're actually affecting your brain. The ideas are like a virus, and they're worming their way into your brain and priming your brain to be very, very worried about your back. We'll return to that idea in a moment, because I'd like to speak a little bit about treatments. Modern society is mechanical. We have cars, we have planes, we have computers, like the one that I'm speaking to you from today. And because of that, I think we've come to develop this very mechanical view of our bodies. Consider a car. You know, if there's smoke coming out of your bonnet, it signals that there's a problem with your car's engine. We remove the broken component, replace it, and return the car to the highway. This mechanistic thinking has come for us all. When my car breaks down, I will pop the bonnet and have a look at the engine, despite having absolutely no idea what I'm looking at. But we have internalized it. If there is a problem, a part must be broken, we must replace the part, and then our car will be fixed. We've been applying this mechanical thinking to back pain for decades with absolutely dismal results. To talk to you a bit about treatments, what works and what doesn't, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to a guest speaker who's been kind enough to come down today, Professor Chris Marr. Chris is my friend and my mentor and was instrumental in writing Backup. But more importantly than that, he is the founding director of the Institute for Musculoskeletal Health. Chris has been kind enough tonight to agree to talk to us about something he's one of the leading experts in, the level of evidence for several common back pain treatments. Chris, have I got you there?
Yes, I'm here, Liam. Thank you for the introduction.
My pleasure. Chris, can I start off with, well, since I've been talking to people about this book, I get so many calls from people discussing back pain treatments that, to be honest, I'd never heard of. But I'd like to start with one that I think comes up a lot. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know about the evidence for chiropractic treatment for back pain?
Well, I guess that's an interesting issue because chiropractic is a profession, not a treatment. So there's a range of chiropractors practicing across Australia, and some of them offer different treatments to others. And so essentially it comes down to what the chiropractor offers. You know, some chiropractors offer much the same as a physiotherapist. So if they're offering you an evidence-based treatment for back pain, it's likely to be successful. But unfortunately, they're quite a mixed profession. So there's some chiropractors who would provide manipulation of the back to cure diabetes or deafness and all sorts of things like that. So it really comes down to what that specific chiropractor decides to do for that particular patient with low back pain. And it probably is the same for a medical doctor and a physiotherapist. My background is physiotherapy, and there are some physiotherapists who provide evidence-based treatments, some of them who do research and develop evidence-based treatments, and unfortunately a small number who decide to practice in ways which were perhaps what they were taught maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but at the moment they're not actually best practice and the best way to treat people. So it usually comes down to what that particular practitioner is doing rather than judging people by the type of profession they come from.
Chris, you mentioned evidence-based treatments that a chiro or a physio might be able to apply. What sort of treatments would people be looking at if they were hoping to receive evidence-based therapy from a chiropractor?
They would be looking to get some education, some advice about what they can do to self-manage their back, which would be the same that a good GP and a good physiotherapist would do. There's a little bit of evidence that manipulation can help if you do a short course of it for acute low back pain. There's also some evidence that exercise is useful for chronic low back pain, and some chiropractors do that, and some physios and some exercise physiologists do that. And as you mentioned, there's some new treatments, you know, cognitive functional therapy. And, you know, a lot of people are grabbing hold of that approach and thinking about whether they can do it. And some of those people are chiropractors. And so it really is, and I think this is what's difficult for consumers. It depends upon what your particular practitioner is providing as to whether you're getting a good service. It's not based upon the profession, which is, I wish there was a different way we could market back pain services to Australian consumers. You know, maybe we could have a list of professions who, you know, they've got the blue tick, and that particular practice just offers evidence-based treatments. That'd be wonderful. It would help consumers navigate what is actually a very complex landscape.
If only, Chris. Can I ask about one common one that chiros offer, which is spinal manipulation? For you know, people will often be offered long-term courses of this. What is the evidence base like for that treating back pain?
Well, there's no evidence base for that, and so that's a a form of practice of chiropractic, which seems to be about building the revenue stream for the practice rather than helping the consumer. And so a lot of chiropractors, the ones I interact with, would be embarrassed by their colleagues who would offer that sort of program, because there's no way that you could see a person on day one and be able to say this person needs 30 sessions of manipulation. And by the way, I can sell you a discounted package for your wife to come along and also get 30 as well. That doesn't make sense at all.
Chris, what about steroid injections? I know many people receive these almost as frontline therapies. I think my dad tried a range. Do we know how well they work and if they offer any risk of side effects?
Depends where you want to stick them. So sometimes people stick a steroid injection to a facet joint. So they're the small joints at the side of your back. That's been shown not to work any better than injecting those joints with a placebo.
Wow.
There is a condition called sciatica. And for sciatica, an epidural injection, so around the nerve root of a corticosteroid, can provide some temporary relief. The argument about whether you want to do it is that the effect is reasonably small, but it tends to be, a fairly easy treatment to get and fairly cheap. I think there was an example in the United States where there was a problem where the compounding pharmacy that was making up epidural steroid injections, they got a fungal infection in it. And unfortunately, a lot of people had, quite severe side effects from that. And that was something that hasn't happened in Australia. It's some peculiar situation that occurred in the United States. But if we're practicing as it would be in Australia, I think the risk of side effects is quite low, and it's probably a treatment that people would consider if it's for sciatica, not for that other form of back pain.
Yeah, for non-specific back pain, which I think many of our listeners might have, what's the evidence base like?
Well, the evidence base would be that epidural steroid injections don't work for non-specific low back pain. There's also another form of back pain, which is more common in older people, called spinal canal stenosis, and epidural steroid injections don't work for that. So across a lot of different forms of back pain, there are some treatments that work, and there are other treatments for different indications that don't work. And I guess that's the challenge, as I mentioned earlier, trying to navigate that space, getting some good advice from different people. Because I guess when I listen to your introduction, if you're a consumer listening to that, you might feel a bit depressed. But I think there is actually some good news. And I think you also covered that. But sometimes when you're listening, you just hear the negatives. And I guess my position in 2023 is that we're, at a point in time where we've got some good things to offer consumers. We've gone through and we've studied a lot of treatments. We know the things which are ineffective. We know the things which are harmful. Don't do those things. We know some tried and true old treatments that seem to work a little bit. And as you mentioned earlier, there's these new forms of treatment developed by Australian researchers, which seem to have quite good effects for chronic low back pain. And so that's why I guess I feel confident. I think we're in a really good position. But the challenge is, how do we get those treatments to consumers? Because at the moment, the system we have for funding of healthcare doesn't fund those treatments. So you could get Medicare-funded harmful treatments for your chronic low back pain, but you wouldn't be able to get Medicare-funded cognitive functional therapy, which is the treatment you're referring to, which has been shown to be quite effective for chronic low back pain. So we need to talk to politicians and lobby for changes so that the effective and the cost-effective treatments are available to Australian citizens. And we should think about restricting the ones which are harmful and ineffective.
Chris, you're stealing my thunder here.
Oh, sorry about that.
I promise I am going to bring everybody onto the new, really exciting stuff. But I do just want to talk a little bit more about treatments, because I think a lot of people are still encountering and being offered these. There's one more that I really just want to pick up with you, which is surgery, which is something a lot of people raise with me. There are obviously a range of different surgeries running from decompression through to artificial discs through to spinal fusions. Can you give listeners a bit of a guide rail as to when surgery might be valuable and when it might not be valuable?
The only form of surgery that's shown to be useful for a back condition is discectomy for sciatica. And so that seems to work for people. In the longer term, surprisingly, there's no difference between surgery and not having surgery. But if I had acute sciatica and it was, terribly painful, I think I'd probably rush in and have the early surgery, because I don't want to live with the misery for a year. But for every other form of surgery, it's either unknown or proven to be ineffective. And so things such as disc replacement surgery, fusion, decompression for people who've got spinal canal stenosis, these are not evidence-based forms of surgery for back pain. It's really just that one form of surgery for sciatica due to a disc prolapse. And there are a few trials that would suggest that that's a useful thing to do. It would give you more rapid recovery of your symptoms than just not having the surgery. But in the long run, by the time you get out to a year, the outcomes are pretty similar.
That's pretty extraordinary, right, Chris? Like, we offer such a variety of surgeries for back pain, and you're really saying that only one surgery actually is supported by the evidence.
And that's the most simple form of surgery. So some of these other forms of surgery are big surgery. So fusion, disc replacement surgery, they're really quite complex surgeries, more expensive, more risks of harm, but they're the ones that we don't actually know if they work. And so there are some researchers in Australia trying to work out that issue. There's one of my colleagues in Sydney is doing a placebo-controlled trial of decompression surgery of spinal canal stenosis. And hopefully in a year or two, we will understand whether that surgery actually works.
Yeah, terrific. Chris, thank you so much. We're going to have Chris back a bit later on to answer questions. I can see lots are already coming through. So I think my takeaway from that really is it rams home that many of the most common back pain treatments, on the evidence that we have, just don't work very well and do come with risks. But there's two contextual big pictures here that I want to hit on. And I think first, one of the key ones is that we as consumers of back pain medicine need to be really alive to the role of the profit motive. And this may be perhaps because I'm a skeptical journalist, but I think that the profit motive plays a very key role in shaping the way that some back pain treatment is distributed. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about spinal cord stimulators. These are little computers that are essentially wired into the nerves to treat chronic pain. In the decades that we have had them, the industry has really failed to develop the high quality, convincing evidence that they work. That's different from the evidence that we have. The industry has published a lot of scientific papers, but we have researchers whose job is to sort of sort out and check for bias and check for weak study designs. And they, until recently, have been saying, the evidence here just is not of good quality. That hasn't stopped thousands of these devices being implanted in people all around the world. They really started out where they probably should be as a treatment of last resort, but in our investigation, we found that they were being implanted for increasingly mild cases of back pain. Some people even describing, a 6 out of 10, and they were sort of prompted towards a spinal cord stimulator before any other treatment was applied. Why perform a treatment with a very limited evidence base? I think in most cases, the doctors genuinely want to help people, but I do suspect that profit also plays a role. These devices cost north of $40,000 to $60,000, and the industry is extraordinarily lucrative. I suppose I am concerned that if you, as a doctor, already believe that these devices work, there is also a very strong financial incentive that goes on top of that to continue to install them. Industry plays a big role in this as well. Big companies can fund studies and design them or subtly bias them to make the results seem much more positive and much more close to what they would like to tell, the story that they would like to tell. We document several examples of this in backup. These studies often conclude that stimulators work well and are largely risk-free. We sort of had to live with that claim for a long time until the Age decided to test it. We got adverse event notification data from medical regulators, and they showed that hundreds of people have been harmed by these devices, leaving them incontinent or unable to walk. Now, that doesn't mean that these devices are too risky to be used, but it does suggest that in some cases, some people are being harmed. So you can see, I think, that it's not just that these treatments don't work, although they don't. I suspect that it's our entire mechanical approach to thinking about and treating back pain that hasn't worked. I want to quickly talk about one more treatment to sort of tell you the story. In 2017, researchers in Holland were running a large, high-quality trial of a treatment called radiofrequency denervation. Essentially, using hot wires to burn off any nerve causing pain, often near an allegedly painful disc. Now, if these nerves were going into the disc and it was the disc that was causing pain, burning them off should stop that pain, right? You cut the cord, cut off the signal, and yet our subjects did not experience less pain. Researchers were unable to find any improvement in pain scores. Burning the nerves, cutting the cord made no difference. What that says, to some researchers at least, is this: pain is so much more complex than we think. Now, this brings us to the neuroscience, to the exciting part of tonight's presentation, to the bit that hopefully you can take away and feel a little bit hopeful about, as I certainly do. The way nearly everybody thinks about pain is like this. Something painful happens, it shoots a signal all the way up to your brain, and then ding, you have pain. This idea comes from René Descartes in the 16th century. But here's the thing, René didn't know what he was talking about. Pain doesn't work like that at all. You can work this out yourself. Many people will have had the experience of suffering an injury, like a cut, and not noticing it for a while. You know, you're distracted, you're doing other things. I did this myself when I was younger. I got stuck on some barbed wire, and I didn't notice until I'd unhooked myself from the barbed wire and was walking away, these huge cuts in my hands. I still have the scars. Only then, once my brain noticed the injury, did my pain start hurting. We see it with, shark attack survivors who won't describe any pain until they get themselves to the shore. And then they'll be like, oh my God, I'm in extreme pain. What this experience tells us is the brain plays a central role in pain, which makes sense. Because of course, without the pain, without the brain, we wouldn't feel any feelings at all. We wouldn't feel love or hunger, and we certainly wouldn't feel pain. But what's really amazing here is that the brain plays a really active role in deciding about pain. Oh, I forgot to mention who this gentleman was. So this gentleman was a man who we met who had a spinal cord stimulator implanted. And while he didn't suffer from it, it didn't work at all for him. And he was so frustrated by it that he had it taken out, and there he is holding it. He usually keeps it in his cupboard, but very, very expensive paperweight, he said to me. So I'm going to play you a little video with another experiment to think about while we're thinking about the spooky world of pain. It's from Lorimer Moseley, perhaps one of the world's top pain researchers. Can we play that video now, team?
We did an experiment that relates to vision and how different information gives us meaning. We got a whole group of people who described themselves as normal individuals, but they did volunteer for a pain experiment. They're probably not normal. We should really say this experiment was done in a group of psychologically questionable, poverty-stricken students. But in each situation, just think about what we did here. This is a very cold probe that goes on the back of their hand. And we did not tell them it was cold. We just told them it was a probe, and there might be different temperatures of the probe. And then we showed them at the same time either a red light, because red means hot and danger. Or for some of the trials, so some of these stimuli, we showed them a blue light. And blue means safety and cool. For every single stimulus they got, the probe was always the same temperature, real temperature. It was always minus 20 degrees, which is very cold, but not particularly dangerous for more than a few seconds. We asked them a lot of questions, but this is what they responded when we asked them about pain. So we said, did that hurt? And if it did, how much did it hurt? And you can see how much we rely on this horrible 0 to 10 scale that you all hate. Each line belongs to a person. Each person got, I think, about 10 different stimuli in each condition. And the fact that all of these lines, well, not all of them, most of them tend to go up in that direction, tells us that for nearly all of these supposedly normal people, the same stimulus with a red light hurts more than it does with a blue light because of the meaning. We've changed meaning. Now you can see this person here, this person here, they're idiots. Their brain doesn't process that meaning, or perhaps they were colourblind. Who knows?
Matt really is the best. He puts us science communicators to shame sometimes. So hopefully what you got from that was this idea that Lorimer and other neuroscientists around the world are really starting to elucidate, which is that pain is enormously complex and that the brain plays a really important role. And so the core question that I had when I was learning about this was, well, okay, if that's true, then surely we must be able to use this. Like if that stacks up, then we should be able to use this to achieve treatment outcomes for people with back pain. And we can, which is really exciting. We'll come to that in a sec. So what Lauren was trying to describe is that pain is a bit like an alarm system or a danger signal, a way for the brain to whip us into action to prevent something bad happening. Kick a table with your knee, and your brain sends you a quick signal to say, hey, stop doing that. You're going to damage yourself. There are no pain signals, only danger signals. The brain interprets the danger signal along with all the other information available to it and decides whether to generate pain. The brain plays a core role in the pain experience. And because of the way we talk about our backs, some scientists think about our backs, we're setting it up to be really, really worried about any ache or pain in the region of our spines. The unfortunate reality, folks, and I wish I had better news for you on this, is that our backs are going to hurt from time to time. We put a lot of load through them. But making our brains so fearful of that pain means that we put ourselves at risk of falling into a dark vortex of chronic pain and disability that sucks us all the way down to the bottom. So, if the brain is key to back pain, we should expect that brain-focused therapies for back pain might actually work where other more mechanical therapies have failed. And as Chris said earlier, here's where it gets exciting, folks, because we are starting to frank this theory about back pain with treatments that are focused on the brain and that have strong evidence suggesting they work. Let me introduce you to them. First, we have pain science education. This is kind of the grandfather of these treatments. It's designed by Lorimer Moseley, the man who we just saw, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. The concept here in some ways is quite simple. By explaining to the brain how pain really works, how it doesn't always mean tissue damage, you can change the way the brain thinks about pain and you can cut fear. A review of the evidence for this treatment, published in 2019, shows it does provide small improvements in pain levels and improves people's ability to go about their lives. It works. And it's side effect free. We then have two new treatments that I like to think of as pain science on steroids. And they're based on a new idea that goes along with the pain neuroscience, that maybe back pain isn't just driven by fear, but also by a breakdown between brain and back. A breakdown between brain and back. What does that mean? Your brain is constantly getting huge amounts of data from your body, where it is in space, if different parts are hot or cold, if you're hungry. In a healthy body, all that information flows in and is nicely balanced. And your brain sits there monitoring it all and feeling comfortable about the way that your body is. But research shows that in some people with chronic back pain, this pattern of data gets out of whack. Your brain starts to lose that fine-grained information about your back, those regular status updates. And then it has to start guessing. Our brains, as we've talked about, are primed to worry about our backs. And then they start losing all that information telling them how the back's doing. It's a recipe for disaster. Learning about this made me think of one of those things that my dad had said to me. At the height of his pain, he felt twisted, like his torso was somehow twisted 90 degrees to his legs. He knew that was anatomically impossible. But what may have happened, researchers say, is his brain had lost that tight knit, that tight connection with his back. Let's say you buy that theory about the breakdown between the brain and the back. How do you put the brain and the back together? Through a new treatment called graded sensoromotor retraining. Now we have a slide here from JAMA, one of the world's leading journals, that looks at the results of this treatment. This treatment starts with pain education, much as Lorimer's treatment does. Then patients move on to the pictures, images of backs under strain. Golfers pinging balls down the fairway, twisting their back as they go. People lifting heavy loads with their backs. People with back pain actually find these images really uncomfortable to look at. Why? There's no physical reason. This is a bit of an aha moment for a skeptical patient who will sit there and go, oh, why do I find this so uncomfortable to look at? Because the brain is playing a role. The researchers will then show patients a slideshow of images of people's backs. Each image is rotated clockwise or counterclockwise or placed upside down. The exercise is really simple. Say which way the image is rotated. The idea is to activate your brain and relink it with your back. There's physical stuff too. You lie on the floor and the physio takes out a stick and you have to identify whether the end is sharp or dull. It sounds ridiculous. It really does. But it gets the brain talking to the back. And does it work? Yes. Over 18 weeks, it significantly improved pain intensity compared to a placebo. And it's cheap and it's largely risk-free. So that's graded sensoromotor retraining, which focuses on rebuilding the brain-back connection. And we now have something even more exciting, I think. Cognitive functional therapy. This again comes out of the same school, the focus on the brain, but its focus is really on movement and on fear. And fear, we know, is really crucial in back pain. Cognitive functional therapy centers on changing the way patients think about their backs and how they respond to their pain, encouraging them to stop worrying about posture, stop worrying about a straight back, stop fearing bending. It comes out of a lot of that research we were talking about earlier before that suggests that your posture really doesn't matter as much as you think, that having a straight back when you lift doesn't matter as much as you think. The theory by the researchers who have developed this is that by holding yourself so tense, by bracing yourself, by avoiding movement, you may actually be worsening the problem as your muscles strain under the stress of being held taut all the time. Physiotherapists with this one help patients challenge their fears, movements that create fear, move naturally, and return to normal life. They tell their patients to stop trying to sit up straight, to stop worrying about slouching, to stop trying to engage their core. The physiotherapists who provide this treatment target the painful movements like bending and teach patients ways to move that reduce their pain. Peter O'Sullivan and Mark Hancock, who are two of the researchers behind this treatment, tell me these stories about patients who go through this program. There was one woman, she had a bad back for years, and so she wasn't involved in the life of her grandchild. She couldn't get down to his level. She couldn't pick him up. She couldn't carry him. After this program showed her that actually her back wasn't going to limit her and that she could do that she was stronger than she thought, she was really angry. She was angry that she missed out on so much, but she was also angry that nobody had treated her like this before. What all these treatments have in common, crucially, I think, is that they give you the tools to self-manage your own back pain. I think that's overlooked, but really important. Our medical system is set up to turn us into patients. We go to the doctor treats us or refers us on, we take pills, we go under the knife, we're always promised, this will fix you, I know what to do. And I think that takes our agency away. And if the treatments then don't work, you can end up in this spot where, professionals kind of throw up their hands. They describe it as failed back syndrome, which makes it sound almost as though it was your fault that your back failed. What we're learning from all the research is that the best treatments, the ones that work the best, they do require an investment from us. We need to take part. We need to take charge. We need to change our thinking. That leads me to my last message, which I think really emerges from all the reporting I've done as a science journalist and while writing backup. The medical industry is filled with wonderful people who want to offer wonderful care. Make no mistake about that. And it achieves extraordinary miracles every day. And that can make us somewhat complacent, I think. We think that the doctor knows best. My message to you is take charge of your own care. Consider the evidence for your treatments carefully, rather than just taking whatever people give you or picking the most expensive one, as some consumers do. There are sources of evidence out there that anybody can access. There are websites that will guide you through this. There are great researchers. We now have a really high quality standard of care for low back pain, which you can consult. Take your health seriously. Move, sleep, eat well, avoid chronic stress. Be an active participant in your treatment, because nobody has your best interests at heart more than you do. I think that's everything I have time for. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'm going to invite Chris back up and you can give them to us and hopefully we'll do our best to answer them.
Thanks very much, Liam, and also Chris, for a very comprehensive lecture about what is, quite a critical issue. As you sort of showed by that map of the world, Liam, the prevalence of back pain is just extraordinary these days, let alone, the costs to the individual and to the community, more broadly in relation to back pain and so on. And one thing I really loved about your book is that you really went to that effort of speaking to so many of the top researchers and clinicians and so on around the country, and the level of detail within it was really fantastic to read. So, and thanks so much, Chris, for your input tonight. Just one thing, so you mentioned cognitive functional therapy. Chris or Liam, could you just give us a nice sort of succinct definition of what that is, because it's been mentioned a couple of times. So, obviously, just a layperson's explanation, just to sort of sum up the references made throughout the lecture so far.
Yeah, I think I described it a bit, but Chris, maybe you want to have a go? How would you describe CFT?
I guess if you're thinking about it, it's the two words. It deals with people's cognition. So part of it is individually based, talking to people about their conceptions about their back pain and whether the back is strong or what can harm it. So there are some speaking therapies. And I guess the functional is this graded exposure to movement, and it's graded exposure to the feared movement. In the same way, if someone was an arachnophobic, they were scared of spiders, we gradually expose them to spiders. If someone's scared of movement of the back, we gradually expose them to movement of the back and show them that it's safe. And the last thing that's part of it, which is not in the name, is adopting a healthy lifestyle. As Liam talked about, appropriate rest and sleep, food, physical activity, all those sorts of things. So it's bundling together a number of things. The other thing I hope I can take a little bit of time to cover is some of the chat was talking about some conditions which are serious that cause back pain. The really good news is that in primary care, so people going to see the GP, physio or chiropractor, a serious cause of back pain is quite uncommon. So occasionally, people could have cancer, they could have an infection, they could have a fracture that's the cause of their back pain. For people turning up to the GP or physio, that's less than 1% of cases. And if you've got long-term back pain, it's really uncommon that you've got a serious cause of back pain. There's only really 1 or 2 forms of arthritis that would cause long-term low back pain like that. So it is appropriate to go and see a medical doctor and have a medical examination to screen for those very rare conditions. But in general, that's not the cause of most people's long-term back pain in Australia.
Yeah, can I just add to that, Chris? I think that's a key point. I don't mean to minimise any people with that very serious pathology. What backup tries to focus on is this large group of people who often have back pain and don't have a pathological diagnosis, and I think that's a really frustrating experience for many people. They have pain and nobody can really tell them what is wrong. So I don't want to minimize anybody's experiences. That's sort of the focus of what we were talking about.
And I think that message that you finished up there with, Liam, also just about that, the role of self-management and sort of, having agency within your own, the self-efficacy and agency within your own care. I think that's very, very, very important and very powerful. Did you come across in your sort of investigations, did you come across anything around remedial massage therapy for back pain? There's a question about, whether you found much information or research, and Chris, you as well, regarding remedial massage therapy.
Yeah, I think that's probably a therapy question. So let me throw that one to Chris.
Yeah, I guess the takeaway message is generally things where you are passive tend not to help with long-term back pain. So the program that Liam talked about, and I think, people have got to invest some time into it. So just going to a masseur and lying on the plinth and being massaged is probably not going to help most people with chronic low back pain. And the same with, so that would be the take-home message. Things which are generally passive tend not to work for chronic pain.
Can I add a little to this, though? I really like massage. I use it, I enjoy it, but I suppose I also think to myself, this isn't going to cure any back pain that I have, but that doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable.
No, exactly. So as part of a structured active program, then maybe massage is okay. But if it's the sole focus of therapy, I think that's potentially the trap, that if you think that you can just go to a masseur, lie down, and they're responsible for fixing your back, so I've given my back problem to the masseur to fix, I think that's probably, I know that's not the right way to manage a long-term back problem.
I've also encountered some people who tell me that they will get a massage and that will then help them move more, which I think is terrific. I think, Chris, you've also talked to me in the past about using heat in the same sort of way. So you might be able to get a massage and that sort of limbers things up, and then you can put those other healthy living strategies that we know really work well into practice.
Exactly.
And I suppose, Chris, as you sort of commented earlier, with regards to whether you're talking about physiotherapists or chiropractors and so on, it depends on how they might practice at the end of the day. I guess probably the key thing is whether someone feels like that whatever they're, whichever practitioner they're seeing, or even whether they're undertaking massage as well, whether that's actually giving them some benefit. Is that a key sort of, in a way, measure that people can use, whether they feel like they're making good progress and gaining some benefit from whatever they're doing in relation to sort of seeking either sort of external help from a health professional or actually undertaking their own self-management strategies?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. So if you're seeing a good clinician, at the beginning, they would have set out a program, there'd be goals of treatment, there'd be a plan for starting therapy, and there's also a plan for stopping therapy. So if you're seeing a provider and you're seeing them for a long period of time and making no progress towards those goals that both of you set, then it's time to make the decision that this is not helping. When you're seeing a physiotherapist, a chiropractor, a GP, and things are going well, we're usually talking about a very time-limited course of therapy. You know, we're not talking about ongoing therapy for the rest of your life. You know, for some forms of therapy, we're talking about, you know, maybe once or twice a week for 6 weeks. That's the sort of volume of therapy that we're talking about. And what you would see over time is people gradually improving. I mean, when we've done studies with people with acute low back pain, on average, people take about 17 days to fully recover with no treatment. So that's in the group of people who got a placebo, you know, acute low back pain, 2.5 weeks, you know, most people are recovered by that point in time. And so there's sort of these yardsticks or benchmarks where people can think about how long is it going to take to recover. And you really should be seeing improvement with each session when you're going to see the chiropractor, the physiotherapist, or the GP. And if you're not, you know, you need to think about getting a second opinion. You need to see progress when you're seeing a practitioner.
And there was just a comment or question about what about specific back pain as opposed to non-specific back pain, and where steroids might fit in for stenosis. Chris, I think that sounds like a very clinical question. Is that enough information for you?
Yeah, so there's a condition that's more common in older people called spinal canal stenosis. And so the spinal canal becomes narrowed, usually with bone and soft tissue. And these people get leg pain that stops them walking. It tends to be relieved if they are more flexed, and gets worse if they're extended. For that condition, there's been trials of corticosteroid spinal injections, and they're ineffective. So for that particular condition, it doesn't work.
And in relation to someone first sort of attending, seeing a health professional and so on, of course, there would be a process of just checking that there's not some other serious pathology causing the pain to begin with. What does that process involve?
So when you're seeing a practitioner, they would usually take a focused history and a clinical assessment, and they're searching for what we would call red flags or alerting features. So these are symptoms and signs which are associated with these specific forms of disease which masquerade as simple low back pain. And so there are things such as unexplained weight loss, night pain, bladder and bowel dysfunction, skin rashes, swollen joints associated with the back pain. You might have painful stinging eyes. So once you start to get systemic features beyond the low back, you need to start thinking, is there something else that's causing my low back pain? Because that's not garden variety, non-specific low back pain. If people are starting to get these other symptoms from other parts of the body, other systems of the body, maybe it's a form of arthritis that's causing it. And so you need to see a good clinician, and the clinician needs to take a proper history, a proper clinical assessment, and then they're in a position to say, look, you don't have those serious forms of disease. We think you've got non-specific low back pain or simple low back pain, which can be treated with the approaches that Liam talked about. But to be fair, you know, if you didn't do that clinical assessment and you're treating everybody with the simple approaches, occasionally you're going to come into serious problems, because it's very hard, if you're not doing a proper assessment, to distinguish serious back pain from these simple forms of back pain that we've talked about.
And Liam, there's a comment from question, would the government backing evidence-based treatment for back pain put a lot of interventional pain specialists out of a job?
That's a great question. I'm not sure it would put them out of a job, but it certainly may change the way that they do practice. Just looking at one intervention, spinal cord stimulators, we reported earlier this year on a call from some researchers and from private health funds for these to be taken off Medicare. But one story that we tell again and again in backup is that there are very powerful vested interests that try and prevent this. So you might remember about 10 years ago, spinal fusions were in the news, and everybody came out and sort of agreed, oh yes, we really shouldn't be doing these for non-specific low back pain. That's pain with no pathology. Everybody agreed. Everybody thought it was a great idea. So we went and had this long process with the government where they tried to remove them from the top tiers of private health insurance so that, people wouldn't be able to go and order them, and because we know that so much of this surgery is paid for through private health insurance. And what happened? At the end of the day, these surgeons lobby, who are very powerful, kicked up such a stink that the government dropped the whole process, and we ended up back at square one with these extraordinarily expensive surgeries that lack an evidence base still being done. So, I hope that it changes and improves in the future, but there are powerful vested interests in this sector.
Thanks, Liam. And just Chris or Liam, someone's asking, in major accidents, some people don't feel pain. Why is that?
Yeah,
is it again the connection with the brain?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this. Chris might choose to correct me. I think we see this also in people who are bitten by sharks, and we see it in soldiers who are shot at war and can be quite seriously injured, but their brain sort of, I think, goes, well, the pain is not particularly useful for you. You need to go and save your life. And so the pain system really doesn't sort of fire itself up. It gives you a chance to go and get out of harm's way. It's a reasonably sophisticated system. I mean, what's your take on that, Chris?
Yeah, in battle, it wouldn't be particularly adaptive to drop to the ground and start writhing in agony if you've just had. So I think, yeah, it's a really good example of why you can't just interpret pain as, someone's pushed a switch and it goes up the wire and then it gets the brain and that causes pain. It's much more complex than that. And so, the brain interprets all this input, and depending upon the context, it's whether that stimulus is interpreted as pain. And in a war zone, or when you're being attacked by a shark, it doesn't interpret it as pain because there's more important things to do, survival of the human.
There's a comment or question around medical imaging. Just asking, why can we not have medical imaging that provides a range of norms for age and gender, similar to what we have for our pathology tests, as this may take the risk out of how imaging can affect people's back pain experience and catastrophizing. So I know in your book, Liam, you cover a lot about imaging, and maybe both you and Chris could just comment about the place or the role of imaging within the diagnosis and management of back pain.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Jen. So they're asking about whether it should be sex and age standardized?
Yeah, well, it sounds like that with regards to, if there was an ideal, I suppose, image for different, ages and genders.
Yeah, maybe I could take this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you get a blood test, and it comes back and you've got all these normative values, and the GP can just look across and say, oh, that one's above normal. When you get a radiology report done, the radiologists report everything. And so there's miles of stuff there. And so what people are suggesting now is, as well as reporting everything, you also need to say, in this person's particular age group, in people without pain, 40% of people have this particular finding. And so, and those findings of degeneration in the spine become more common the older that you become. And so there's this argument that you should be providing that sort of information, analogous to the way that you provide information for laboratory tests, so people can interpret whether that particular anomaly is actually likely to be related to their back pain. And the older you get, things like disc degeneration are quite common in old people who don't have any back pain. And so they may not be the cause of their back pain.
Can I add a couple of things to that? Because I can see Neen Monty in the chat. I think there is a really interesting study that we sort of talk about in the book about how these scans are interpreted. So they took a 65-year-old woman and they sent her off to get imaging at 10 different radiographers around her. And the results came back, same image, the findings almost didn't overlap at all, because you're really trying to judge based on this. So there is a really wide variety of things that can come back from those scans. But I think the other thing about them that I find striking is when you look at the long-term data. So you would think if you're being mechanical, to return to our car image, you open the hood of the car, you look down, you get some information. But what actually seems to happen to people with back pain is somehow in the process of looking, down into the bonnet, they actually damage the car. And that's quite an odd idea. But what the suggestion is what happens is you look and you suddenly turn yourself from a person into a patient with back pain, into a patient with this really scary scan, into a patient who's rapidly being medicalized and taken down this pathway of pain intervention and then surgical intervention and pharmaceutical intervention. And when they look at these long-term studies, they can see that simply whether randomizing people between getting a scan or not getting a scan has a really long tail of effect on what will be done to these people. I think when I wrote the book, that was sort of one of the first clues reading that data, that back pain really doesn't operate in the sort of way that other fields do or that we imagine. It's very strange.
And I know I've heard Peter O'Sullivan sort of talk about this in the past, how some of the language used around back pain or people's backs and so on can be quite damaging in relation to the way people perceive themselves and their health status and so on. So you made that point earlier, Liam, and you certainly do so in your book. Chris, this is probably a question for you. Someone has just commented saying, why has it taken so long for the medical community to come to these conclusions or where we are today with this information?
It's a long answer, but one of them is that when I returned to the university and was teaching in the medical program, I was horrified to find that the amount of time spent on low back pain is trivial. Like, it was about 2 hours. And so, the medical practitioners leave the course with an inadequate training in back pain and a barely adequate training in musculoskeletal conditions. And that's the same across the whole of the world. And so there's certain conditions which are more commonly included in the medical curriculum. So things such as respiratory disease, diabetes, cancer, all those other things. But for some reason, musculoskeletal conditions are viewed as trivial, and they don't get much prominence in the curriculum. Thankfully, I've managed to make some changes across the University of Sydney's curriculum, aided by a colleague who's a rheumatologist. And so that's one of the reasons why the average medical doctor knows, not quite as much as they need to about musculoskeletal conditions, but we're trying to change that.
I think there's also a historic reason, Jen. When surgeons first started trying to treat conditions of the spine, they had some early success with sciatica. They discovered that they were able to, by surgically attacking the disc, relieve symptoms of sciatica. And they were like, this is amazing, we're going to be able to offer fantastic treatments. And it was a really significant advance. Unfortunately, at that time, they went a step too far and said, all right, well, the discs are causing sciatica. The disc, therefore, must be the cause of all back pain. And for decades, the whole field became absolutely obsessed with the disc as the cause of back pain. And we tried all sorts of strange things. We tried to shrink it or melt it or replace it with artificial discs or remove it altogether and fuse bone in its place. And so I think the field, unfortunately, because it became obsessed with the disc, that they call it the dynasty of the disc, really has sort of headed in the wrong direction for a very long time. And it's only now that they're sort of accounting for that and going, this approach actually really hasn't gotten us very close to curing people's back pain. We need something else.
Okay, and we're getting close to finishing with the questions, but there's a question that came in that, does this new science in relation to the management of back pain distinguish between different types of back pain, or is it true for all back pain, or for that matter, all pain?
I think that the three treatments, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, they're looking at chronic low back pain without serious pathology. Is that right?
Yeah, so they would have gone through a process of medically screening the participants. And so if someone's got one of these specific diseases, the red flag conditions, they would not be included in those trials. And so I think these general approaches would apply for chronic pain, but it would also be chronic pain that's not explained by some serious disease. And so we're talking about non-specific chronic pain and non-specific chronic low back pain, which could be safely managed with these approaches. It would be dangerous to use this sort of approach if someone's got cancer as the cause of their back pain. That wouldn't be an appropriate thing to do.
And just for one comment here, someone sort of just asking about osteoporosis, Chris. So would that be a condition for which this approach may not be appropriate because it requires a different approach?
Osteoporosis by itself won't cause back pain. If you have an osteoporotic compression fracture, yes, that would be exquisitely painful. And yes, if you've got an osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture, that's treated in a different fashion. It wouldn't be treated with this graded exercise approach. As you could imagine, mobilizing a fracture is not going to be very comfortable.
I think we might finish with the questions and the comments at that point. There is just one question sort of asking where your book can be purchased, Liam, and it certainly is available on our Musculoskeletal Australia website via our MSK shop, apart from elsewhere, but it's certainly available at our MSK shop. So look, at that point, I will thank you, Chris and Liam, and I'll hand you back just for a final sort of closing comments from our CEO, Helen Jens. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Liam and Chris, and thank you for everyone who engaged with the comments and questions. Although this is my first Koadlow lecture, I believe our presenters this evening have set a very high benchmark for all future presenters of the Koadlow lecture. So I would like to thank you both for doing that. As Jen mentioned, can I encourage anyone who hasn't already bought their copy of Liam's incredibly personal, insightful, and at times challenging and confronting book, Back Up, to head to the MSK online shop and do so now. It really does leave readers with a sense of empowerment and hope. Before we finalise the Koadlow lecture for this evening, I would like to take a brief moment to thank the Musculoskeletal Australia team who have made this evening possible. Whilst it has truly been a team effort by all the MSK staff, I particularly want to thank Genevieve Nolan and Kay Mwaba for all their efforts in ensuring this evening has been such a great success. As we look back on the foundations on which Dr. Les Koadlow built Musculoskeletal Australia, I think you'll agree it's only possible due to the generosity and support of all those people who donate, who financially contribute, who give their time and expertise, like Chris and Liam have done tonight, to support us in our endeavours to improve musculoskeletal health here in Australia. We are aiming to be around for another 50 years, and I think if today is anything to go by, we're doing a pretty good job about things all relating to musculoskeletal health. I want everyone to consider completing the consumer survey. As we mentioned, head to our website, scan the code, start taking the survey. And on behalf of Musculoskeletal Australia, a huge thank you for joining us this evening. And I hope you continue to work with us to shine a spotlight on and make musculoskeletal health an absolute top priority here in Australia. Thank you.